Hello, I'm Laura McCullough, Professor of English here at Brookdale Community College, and I am pleased today to be talking to a visiting writer, Brian Turner, being hosted by Student Life and Activities in celebration of veterans in the arts. Now, Brian has been at Brookdale in the past. His first book, Here Bullet, brought him to international fame. His poetry at that time was focusing largely on his experience in Bosnia and in Iraq. Brian has gone on to win many awards, a Lannan and NEA, to be published widely across the country and internationally. Brian's recent work has included a memoir called My Life as a Foreign Country, one of the best memoirs I've read in the last several years. But where he is at right now is promoting a huge project that just happened this fall of 2023. He has 3 new books out, all by the esteemed independent literary press, Alice James Books. The Wild Delight of Wild Things, The Goodbye World poem, and The Dead Peasant's Handbook. Beautiful books. But what's also interesting about these books is that they are multimedia. They are full of scan codes that connect to music albums. He's just dropped 2 new albums, to videos, to a video essay, as well as to meditation soundscape media. So we've got all kinds of things to talk to Brian about today. Welcome, Brian, back to Brookdale.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
So one of the things that I'd like to start asking you about is that relation of media. There's so many components to this: images, sound, collages, albums. It's a constellation of work. How do you actually see this? Is it a trilogy? Is it a triptych? What would you call all of this?
First, I think I'd call it an abundant access to abundant amount of caffeine. You know, it's probably, you know. But no, artistically, I think it's somewhere in between the two or both. Or it's I see it as a trilogy in a sense that it's sort of loosely. It starts small and intimate, and sort of spirals out and out and out, book by book, and then in the end, it sort of dovetails back into the beginning. But at the same time, the reason they were released individually is because I think they each work on their own and they do their own work. So that's, yeah, so I guess I don't have an answer but it's kind of like all of them.
But it's all of them.
Yeah.
And people can enter it in different ways.
Yeah.
As I read the work and engaged with media, it seemed very meta-modern, the moment that we're in terms of critical theory. That this is very hybrid. And it's not about one thing or another, it's about multiple things. There's the historic issues of your writing that have to do with conflict, war, social justice, and then there's a great deal about private grief, the loss of your very talented spouse. And I was wondering if you might speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier before we were on air about how she had read Here before and also had been a part of the television series and all. Yeah, I think the multimedia aspect of it, for example, the very first book, The Wild Delight of Wild Things, I was writing that book and they're very difficult pieces for me to write in there. And at the same time, I was making music. I didn't know that they would be together. I wasn't thinking along those lines. I was just trying to figure out my way in the world now that I had my love. And the language fails me. What do I say? Lost, she's died, all the verbs and all the nouns and the language doesn't, I think there's a problem with the English language. Like we need a whole new verb case, like for the dead to be still living with us. Because they're always put in the past tense or the continuous and that kind of, but none of them are quite satisfying. You know?
That seems to be a huge theme, not just Elise, but many of the people who are no longer present, but that are part of this work and that you are keeping alive.
Yeah, and I guess the second book really starts to amplify that more because it spreads out. You know, in the first book, the music I realized eventually was because the book didn't relieve or sort of bring me to a new place. there's a little bit of sweetness at the end of the book, and but I don't think quite enough for reading. And that's partly why I put the music with it, because what was helping me as I was writing was creating the music. And in fact, it's a 27-minute long sound meditation. That's mostly, there are no actual lyrics to it. It's all human voices with instruments, but it's all the body as a way of meditating through sound. And I was able to process grief and where I am now through doing that in a way that the poems couldn't.
And the
so,
video essays that are the SKU codes on the back of the books also connect to you talking about that process.
Right.
Where readers can see those.
They do, because I talk about some of the themes that come up. Like I think the very first one, I walk up, it's set in the ocean, so you'll see me walk up to the camera and begin to talk about things like love and loss. And then I go into it from there. It's more, whereas the art has its artifice and goes into moments, and the poems and essays are sort of like transport vehicles. The essays, video essays on the back are more straightforward conversation, talking to breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience, with the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, and although some people would have seen you as a writer who's a veteran who's a writer, so much of this work would be accessible to anyone who has experienced loss of any kind. And some of the themes, that I see in here, I'm on fire. I'm a man on fire who lives in a house on fire. And yet in this first book, the afterword is by Elise, and one of the lines is, "Our fingers cup the universe like water." And so you and Elise are two of the main characters in all of this, but there are multiple elements like fire and water.
Yeah.
What other elements show up, and how are you using those emotionally?
I think the wave itself, waveforms, which can be with light or sound or in water, for example. I think the waves are the through line through all the books. So the very first book starts with a discussion of what waves are in water, how they are. Water is not made up of waves travel through water. They are not. The water is not the wave, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And it kind of goes more into that, so it can be digestible, or you can kind of comprehend it. I can comprehend it better thinking about it. Then the video starts with me walking out from the ocean to talk, and then the sound, the music that comes with that also starts with the sound of the ocean coming in, and then at the very end of the trilogy or triptych, we end with waves there too. So it's a kind of, because I was thinking about grief, I'd heard about grief coming in waves, and then once I started feeling that, where, it can be just a random Thursday afternoon, and suddenly you just feel this weight. You might be in a shop, in a clothing store, getting a T-shirt or something, or driving in traffic, or in your house. You can't plan on when grief arrives oftentimes, but it does feel like a wave sometimes. It just sort of crushingly washes through you.
That reminds me of your second book, Phantom Noise. There's a poem which I won't get the title out of my database here, right? But the returning veteran being like in a Home Depot or a Lowe's, a big box store, and the post-traumatic memories that come back, and it almost sounds like you're connecting that right now with the experience of walking through with a very personal grief of one loss of a love.
Yeah, well, to dovetail back to where you started that question, the question before, I think sometimes like the earlier books I wrote have the landscape of war, and we have all the accoutrements you expect. There's tanks and explosions and helicopters and all that stuff. That's the landscape, but that's not the subject. The subject is not war even. The subject is love and loss. Yeah. And if they're not rooted in that, those what we might call war poems, if they're not rooted in love and loss, then they verge on something that might be more like a kind of pornography of war, a war porn.
Or romanticizing it in some way.
Or romanticizing. And either way, it's not a healthy way of engaging with what's really happening there. Right. And so I think what I've done is I simply shifted my lens to other subjects in my life, but the reservoir that's underneath it is still that fundamental sort of idea of love and loss. So that's what I'm really connected with. And that's why I think, if you've never been in the military and you read these poems, my hope is that they'll resonate one way or another, because at the root is the human experience, not war itself.
Which we all experience. We all experience conflict, love, and loss.
Yeah.
The opening of the Goodbye World poem, in the poem, The Crossing, is the line, "Dying is so intimate." And you have not shied away in these poems about the details of death and walking with someone through their last days. I'm wondering if you can say more about that.
In sharing them, I wrote them for myself, but in sharing them, I was of two minds, because one part I thought, is this going to be healthy if I share these with others? Will it be received in a way that's helpful? I still struggle with that. I'm not sure if I think sometimes it might arrive at the right time for someone, but it might be at the wrong time for another person. But similar with talking about being in the military and military service, I think it's important for veterans when they come home, it's important to have voices of those who've served in the military to speak to the larger population so they can understand the experience, and so we can have a conversation about what does it mean for a war to come home, for example, those experiences that happen usually overseas, and what that means for our society and us as people living together. In a similar way, if we don't talk about death and dying, then we're not helping each other. Each person has to stumble through it every time.
As if they're alone, as if they're the only one ever facing it.
Yeah. And we do another kind of disservice in that way. We're not helping each other with the process. There seems like such a fear of death. I can't speak to other countries, but in America, there's a whole grief and death industries, these industries that deal with it. But at the same time, when one of our cats died, I had a better experience in terms of grief and the process of dying and how it's done in terms of a hospital setting. The veterinarians were so much better with it than the oncologists were at a very good hospital and amazing doctors. They were nowhere, it was just kind of cold and lacked the human part.
You were speaking about that when we were talking before our interview, of things you had experienced with the very recent loss of your mother.
Yes.
And how the system just pulled the personal closure of the death right out of you and your sister's hands.
Yeah, especially the sacred. Because there are structures, there are things and protocols that people have to do, coroners and whoever's going to pick up the body and remove a body from wherever the person had died. But when someone dies at home, and even in hospital when my father died, I remember fairly quickly we were in the intensive care unit, and the medical staff there fairly quickly wanted to kind of move us away from his body, and they had a curtain that they wanted to shut, and they would start to prepare, and they immediately separate us from the sacred.
I'm going to stop you there. Separating from the sacred, and we'll pick up on the second half of our interview. Thank you very much. This is Brookdale TV. I'm Laura McCullough in the English department here at Brookdale. We're here with Brian Turner. Please stay with us. We'll be back in a minute.
There are endless possibilities with Brookdale. Open the door to 75 different associate degree programs and university partnerships with Georgian Core, Kane, and Rutgers University. Plus, over 45 other transfer pathways to pursue a bachelor's degree at colleges and universities across the country and even internationally. Enjoy dual admission, guaranteed acceptance, and other benefits exclusively designed for Brookdale graduates. Brookdale offers access, affordability, and community. Start your future today. 732-224-2020. BrookdaleCC.edu.
Brookdale Community College will kick off its inaugural season officially fielding varsity teams in Valorant, Rocket League, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Brookdale is a member institution and will be competing in the NJCAA. You may find further info and all of their offerings on their website.
At Brookdale Community College, community is our middle name. We support all students. And now we're proud to announce that you may be eligible for free tuition at our college. The Community College Opportunity Grant Program, or CCOG, is available to Brookdale students, paying the cost of tuition and other approved educational fees not covered by other financial aid. Families making up to $65,000, you could be eligible. Enroll now. Discover your success at Brookdale today. Talk to a staff member to learn more.
Hi, I'm Laura McCullough in the English department here at Brookdale, and Student Life and Activities has brought Brian Turner with us this week in celebration of veterans in the arts. We're going to continue our conversation about his 3 new books, the 2 albums, which we actually didn't talk about, but we will in a few minutes, the soundscape, and the video essays that are all on SKU codes in these books. So along with these books comes a whole host of other creative artifacts. I'd like to talk a little bit about the last book. The first section of The Dead Peasant's Handbook is called War and Conflict, and it seems to move a little bit back to some of what you were known for earlier in your career: human violence, the ravages of war. Right now we are dealing again with many international unrest and violence. But there's a poem in there called The Historians, and there's a line that you use multiple times: what they don't tell you about war. What are you trying to tell us, not just about war, but about the sacred, about the relationship between love and loss?
I think that line, what they don't tell you, the you, also becomes, like, the poem is also speaking to me too, you know. So it's I'm part of the you, because as the initial writer, I'm trying not to think about an audience and writing. I'm not writing poems for other people initially. I'm writing them just to figure stuff out in my own life, you know. And then in revision, I start letting the reader back into the room, and to think, like, who is this for, and what is this a conversation? Is this a book I'll share with others? I've written a book, for example, that I don't share with others. I just wrote it for me. But these books, you know, it was for others. But I think if the question lands in myself, then maybe it'll be helpful for others as well. So, you know, what they don't tell you about war, what they don't tell you about love, you know, it's another refrain that comes up later in the book, and that sort of thinking process is like, sort of like in our lives, or in my life at least. It seems like there are things that have been talked about war, for example, and then there's all the unsaid. And the unsaid really needs to be talked about. We need to figure some of the unsaid out, because that's what gets rooted and becomes difficult to carry in our lives, and can hold us back from becoming, I think, a fuller version of ourselves. And also just like part of what we might think of something like a big word like truth. Like, what's the truth about this thing? And, you know, when we talk about going to war, for example, there are banks that are involved in this. There are shipping companies. There's the price of, you know, sunflower oil, and there's a lot of like economies of intention, and economies of scale, and just power that's involved that often isn't talked about, and it is by some, but I don't often see that overtly in poetry necessarily, but. I was trying to think about the war in Ukraine when I was writing that initially, that particular poem, because sunflowers and historians, there are 2, they're like a pair in this book. And those 2 on war, you know, the war in Gaza and the invasion there, it wasn't happening at the time, you know. But as I was writing those poems, once I invited the reader back in, I tried to think at that moment too, how can I write about this thing that's happening now? But it's a sad thing to think, actually, but I knew that in ways that poem would resonate with whatever would happen later. Right. You know?
Yeah, that is a sad thing, yeah.
Yeah.
I
don't
but
know
those
if that
are
gets
only
to your question.
it does, but we'll keep going, because there are many deaths in this entire trilogy on the personal, brothers, family, mothers. Not just Elise.
Yeah.
There's a poem called My Mother Disappearing, which very beautifully on the page, I don't know which designer decided to.
That was me. Yeah.
Really, because it starts to, the text starts to fade away.
Yeah.
There's an epigraph that really struck me as representing a lot of this whole project. By Hans Zimmer. The epigraph is, when I play you a piece of music, that's when you truly look inside me. But Hans Zimmer is a very well-regarded international composer who's done the scores of countless movies that most of us, just ordinary people who don't think about film or literature, would actually know. But he's known for using very interesting sounds, a lot of technology, and unconventional instruments, and most notably, collaboration. It seems to me that he's an artistic influence for you because the albums in here, which are bands, and you've got singers, and you've got all kinds of, other players. So I was wondering why you used him, and if you could talk a little bit about the collaborative process in some of this.
I really admire his work and his presence in the world, and the surprising things that he does. Speaking to those out there, if you get a chance to look him up, if you haven't heard of him before, but try to find him on YouTube or something. But he's just fascinating also just to hear him speak, and he's a brilliant person. And collaboratively, I think, like my name is on the cover of each of these books in fairly big font, and but it's not really fair because to make these 3 books and the albums and the videos that come with them, I tried to count up, I can't get a precise number, but there's about 300 people, roughly.
Wow.
Probably a little more,
Wow.
but there's at least 300 people that helped to make all this happen. So there was a lot of hands in the making and a lot of gratitude from me to a lot of good souls who helped pitch in to help me on my way with this kind of thing and be a part of this.
And Elise Kuznets, your former partner, spouse, wife, whatever works for you, who was a journalist, a poet, an educator, an incredible thinker, for those of us who know her. She is in a lot of this.
Oh yeah, even her voice singing in some of the music, yeah.
Well, that's actually the last song on the album that's related to the last book. The album is called Little Bird Singing, and the song, Some Have Wings. There are a number of questions being posed to you clearly by Elise. What is wisdom if it's missing love? What has hunger taught us about love? Brian, is this wisdom? Is this how we love? Did I get that right? And the song ends with, you talked about oceans before, but also Elise whispering. You've captured a number of Elise's words on the page, but also her voice. Can you talk about how she's still living inside of this project for you?
Yes, and it's with her, but also others. At the core of my sort of emotional life, her, my best friend Brian, who was also a collaborator musically since I was in my teens, and my father. My mother passed away just recently, but when these were being made, those 3 all crossed over, as some might say. And so I lost them, there's a word again, I don't like the language doesn't work, but the impulse with her and the others is common, I think, for many of us when we lose someone we love, and is to memorialize them and create monuments, the Taj Mahal, for example. And each of us may do this in our own way. A graveyard stone, a stone in the graveyard, someplace we can go and lay flowers or place our hearts and be in conversation. So I have that in me too, just as others, and that's part of my life. But another part is 2 of them, my wife Elise and my friend Brian, were both artists. And they both, like I remember Elise, she felt like she was just coming into her powers as an artist. And she was on the cusp of discovering some really amazing things. And so her life as an artist was cut short. So I feel like it's part of my work to be in conversation with her and with Brian and to find ways to not only memorialize, but to collaborate somehow and create new art with them. And I don't have full access to their volition in this process or new material that they might make, but I do have ways of creating new art that they can be a part of, and knowing them as well as I did as artists, to try to be making art that I think that they would appreciate and would like to be a part of and collaborate. So that's part of it is, and the reason behind that is I could do that again for myself, but the reason I share it, I was a little bit selfish with her in my life, and I was a bit guarded. I wanted her for me, and I didn't share her as much as I could have when she was with us. And now I could see that I wish I hadn't been like that. And so what I'm doing now in part is sharing these poems and essays and songs so that others will discover her in the work and fall in love with her. And so they too, like me, they will carry her, even if it's a small portion, she'll be a part of their imaginative life, and she will live on in these ways too. And my friend Brian as well. So like the song, that song is one I had written many years before, but when I came back from my time in the military, I went down to this apartment in Fresno and we recorded these on 2 acoustic guitars, and we were able to take that actual track of him playing, and then long after he was gone, we added all the rest of the instrumentation, and then we brought in her voice with that. So they're both there, even though, you know, it wasn't done while they were still living. You know?
Well, they're still right here in this presence, right?
Yes, yeah, because they are still
yeah.
alive. And that's the problem I have with it. It's like the landscape of time works differently than the word now. And we're always butting up against this problem. And for the dead, we put them in this case that means as if they are marooned in the past and they're not a part of now. But most of our lives are spent in memory. We're not even in the word now. Like as I see you right now and the light bounces off, it takes parts of a second for my brain to organize all that information and for me to recognize whatever the word now is. We live in the past always. We think we're in the now, but we've never been in the now.
Well, that's what seems so amazing about these artifacts that you've done, because you are including people that are not physically here, as well as, you said, about maybe more than 300 other people in the constellation of your life and loves that have created meaning for you. And it's incredibly, even though it's about love and loss, these are incredibly life affirming.
Oh yeah, for me too, it's really helped me to find my way forward. Because otherwise you're just in despair and ruin, and the worst thoughts can come, you know, and many of you know, why do I keep on living? Why do I, you know? It was hard. I had a lot of anger, and I had to get through that. And now I have to find the way into the rest of my life.
And I love find the way, and that you mentioned anger, because that's one of the waves they talk about in grief. But it is something that can't be ignored. You can't sidestep grief. You have to go through all the waves of it. It is a part of the suffering that maybe helps us become the best people we can be. I wish we had more time to talk today, but we are going to have your reading and a Q&A with students later. Brian Turner, we're so lucky to have him this week. I'm Laura McCullough in the English department, and this has been presented by Student Life and Activities and filmed by Brookdale Television. We hope that you've enjoyed this and you'll see more of our programming in the future. Thank you.